This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon.
Believe it or not, we're only about 70 days into the second Donald Trump era. But as April hits, Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico and the rest of the world are about to kick in, and that's nothing to fool around about. To understand what's coming, we call on Marick Masters, longtime business professor at Wayne State University. So as we record this, right now it's April 1st. April 2nd will be when people hear it, and that's when the tariffs are going to kick in. Trump calls this Liberation Day. As the AP explains it, Trump plans to use tariffs to boost America's reliance on American-made goods and lower our reliance on foreign goods. And so the U.S. is now going to charge reciprocal tariffs to its trading partners. What you charge us is what we charge you. So, Marick, it's April 2nd when people hear this. What's going to happen now? How does life change now?
Well, on April the 2nd, Trump is going to announce changes in worldwide tariffs. That is a part of his effort to really protect manufacturing and other industries in the United States from foreign competition. To a significant extent, particularly with respect to autos, steel, and aluminum, this is driven also by a national security consideration. Trump believes that these industries are vital to our national security, and therefore it's necessary to protect them. He believes that the playing field now in terms of trade is uneven, not only with respect to tariffs, but non-tariff barriers. This is really an effort to reset the world stage and to chart America on a new path to revitalize itself economically. It is very reminiscent of what Richard Nixon did in 1971. We've actually been here before. In 1971, in August, Richard Nixon surprised the nation when he announced not only wage and price controls, but also a 10% import tax across the board. And that was in order to help our balance of payments situation. We were incurring deficits, importing more than we were exporting at that point in time, which was a matter of great concern. We have not had a surplus in our balance of payments since 1975. Each year, we've run a deficit. Now, economists argue about whether this is good or bad and the effects of it. But regardless, the theory of the case is that for those people who are opposed to free trade per se, they say that countries need to do things to protect their industry in the form of tariffs and other incentives that they provide in order to grow manufacturing and other value-added industries in key areas. And really what this is an attempt, I think, without labeling it as such, at an industrial policy. It is very much part of a broader component of the Trump administration's effort to revitalize the U.S. economy, which includes not just these tariff rate hikes, which are to rebalance the world trade situation and protect our industries, but also that it's an effort to reduce the cost of business by reducing the footprint of government. And the footprint of government can be in several areas. It can be in the employment of the federal workforce, which costs money. It can be in direct spending, a lot of which is outside of paying for that workforce, and also can be done in terms of reducing regulation. He wants to do all of those things on a massive scale, unprecedented in recent history. And I think that he's counting on a combination of these things to set the United States on a path to what he calls the Gilded Age. And he's really trying to do what Richard Nixon said in his 1970 speech, 71 speech. And I just got one little sentence from it. That when Nixon imposed the tariffs of 10% and wage and price controls and did other things, he said the following: a nation, like a person, has to have a certain inner drive in order to succeed. In economic affairs, that inner drive is called the competitive spirit. And what he really said was that Americans have to get behind their own industries, buy American products. And that is what Trump is hoping. And that's why he said just the other day that he doesn't care if auto companies raise prices. In fact, he'd just soon have them raise prices on those products that they import so that they
Right.
buy more American cars. Now, whether that contributes to a higher inflation rate and whether or not we can deal with the supply and demand problems, which could contribute to inflation, all of those kinds of things have to be considered as part of this equation. But it's an attempt to really change the nature of the game on an international stage.
Absolutely. I think Trump is sometimes portrayed as ideological in his approach, but what I hear is a very practical approach of essentially saying we're going to treat the world and each country in it the way they treat us. We're no longer going to live by Duchess of Queensberry rules here, and they get to do these massive tariffs and protect their own industries. It sounds like it's a reciprocal approach, and that the thing behind the thing might be, I want you to take down your barriers. If we're going to do free trade, everyone needs to mean it, or no one's going to do it. What do you see there? Do you see this as
You're absolutely on target in terms of his theory of the case. His theory of the case is as Richard Nixon said, is that we've assumed the burden for Europe and other countries in terms of
yeah,
protection. For example, we spend almost $1 trillion on national defense. If you take 8 countries, including France, South Korea, Japan, England, India, they spend just $400 billion altogether on national defense. We are shouldering the burden of protecting them. We are shouldering the burden of financing the war against Russia in Ukraine.
yeah,
We provide the offsetting forces to temper the militaristic ambitions of China in the South China Sea. And also, we are really the world's enforcer of efforts to change the dynamics with respect to the shipment of drugs and also the enforcement of other types of measures that are needed to provide for national security. So Trump's saying we've borne too much of that burden, and we want a reallocation of resources that recognizes that we've made a tremendous contribution to international peace and stability through our efforts. We won the Cold War. Nobody else did. We financed it. We paid for it in South Korea. We paid for it in Vietnam and other conflicts that we had. And therefore, it's time for us to insist that the world reciprocate a bit.
yeah. I mean, where's the peace dividend? Because it seems to me that what we wanted, rather than this reciprocation, rather than everybody uh, pull their own weight, it seems to me we wanted to be the world police. We wanted everyone else to be weak, and then we get to police it because look, you leave Europe to its own devices. Some Hitler, some Napoleon, some Putin, some wild man's gonna mess things up. So we like it when we are the steady hand, and rather than Europe minding its own affairs. Is there a satisfaction level that we had with the status quo?
Well, certainly when we were the preeminent economy and when the US was really 50% of the world's output after World War II, that was the
Yeah,
case. And a
yeah,
lot of the economies in Europe and Asia were in no position to assume any of the burden of protecting themselves or
uh-huh.
being economic players. But by facilitating their growth economically, we contributed in a way to our own decline. And we didn't stay ahead of the game in terms of trying to be efficient in production and innovating at the pace that we needed to in order to maintain our competitive advantage in certain industries, such as in auto and in steel. Therefore, I think we entered ourselves into a self-defeating period in which we lost market share, we lost a lot of jobs, we lost our communities in the industrial belt, so to speak, and that created
Yeah.
a lot of devastating economic impacts. But also, it's true that none of these countries stepped up to the plate, and there was nobody else that would do it. When John F. Kennedy entered office in 1961, he famously said in his inaugural speech that the United States will bear any cost and any burden in order to protect the free world. That was a very profound statement that had a lot of implications.
Mm,
At the
right.
end of, as we were exiting from the Vietnam War, a lot of people spoke then of a peace dividend and how we were going to use that for domestic programs to the benefit of society. And at the time, it was touted to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 billion a year. But that dividend was never realized because there is no more spending beast than the Pentagon. The
Right.
Pentagon is a procurement machine, and they will gobble up money on new weapons programs and spend enormous amounts of money through their revolving door contracts with the defense industry. There is such a marriage of sorts between industry and the Pentagon that they're almost inseparable. And therefore, if we really want to cut spending in the Pentagon, you've got to make some very painful decisions. What Trump has said is that for too long, we've spent too much. We've got $36 trillion in deficit with no end in sight. And
Right.
therefore, we've got to take strong measures, and they're going to be painful. We got to reduce the federal workforce, which he proposed to do, major cutbacks in the workforce there. But there's only about $500 billion in the budget for the federal workforce. And even if you cut half of that, 250, that would be just a small portion of the overall deficit of well over $1.5 trillion. And that would that wouldn't make any
No.
dent in the debt, which is now
Hmm.
36 trillion and rising. So therefore, we've got to take other profound actions, cut spending on contracts and those kinds of things that go a lot to the uh, businesses and nonprofits that we fund. Uh, there are 6 million people in the United States that work for nonprofits. And the federal government funds a lot of them. And I have to ask myself, why are we funding these so-called charities
Right.
to perform a lot of things which many of us would find objectionable?
Well, that's why we fund them. that's
Yeah,
that's why we fund them, because
that's
if
exactly
if
right.
if
Because
what they do was brought up to under any kind of review, if anyone had to sign off on it, we never would. So it's essentially
so
they're
it's
being used as a cat's paw.
it's done under the cover of night, just like the same way
Yeah.
our biggest import in the past several years has been human capital. We've had a flood of people come across the border. Somebody has to bear the cost of this.
Yes.
And it's the taxpayers who bear the cost of it. There were revelations yesterday that the Social Security Administration has a lot of people who are illegals on their rolls, and some of them have been getting benefits. And Elon Musk and others say that some of them might have even voted. Now, I don't know if
Hmm.
that's factual or not. That's certainly something that would have to be determined by a careful analysis of the data. But his technologists have been able to go in there and root out this information where nobody else has. We sat on our laurels and said, oh, it's okay to keep on spending and spending and spending, and we're not going to hold anybody accountable. The Department of Defense fails 7 years worth of audits. Well, that doesn't surprise me at all. They are really good at
Hmm.
hiding money, and there's no way they're going to let anybody find out what they're doing with it. That's not by accident, it's by design.
Absolutely.
It may be a crazy quilt design, but they are good at it. That's when we talk about the deep state, we're talking about things so deep and patterns of conduct so
Oh
embedded.
yeah.
At Wayne State University, we used to call the bureaucracy the Wayne way. It's the Wayne way of doing things. Now, that's been true. I worked at 3 different universities and did various other, jobs at other universities when I taught in their programs, and they all have the same thing. We've all
They all
been in
had a version of
organizations.
the Wayne way.
They all have a version of the Wayne way. So Wayne State isn't
Mhm.
any different than anybody else. But there are ways you get things done. There are ways you mask things. When I was at one university, I won't mention the name, professors were supposed to teach a certain number of credit hours per year, but for us to be able to perform our research roles, they gave us reductions in our teaching load, but on the books, they just assigned other things for us to look like we taught at the full teaching load. It was an effort, basically, to fool the state legislature
It's
that we
fraud.
were teaching more. Well, you can call it fraud. I mean, it's good
I
fraud,
mean,
I
it's
would say.
systematic fraud. It is
Yeah,
literally.
when we were on faculty, and I was at research-oriented schools. I mean, you were trained to do research. If you were a good teacher, I remember one person said, if you come here as a good teacher, that's the kiss of death.
Oh,
You want to be a good researcher, so it's publish or perish.
this was a publisher parish. Yeah.
These universities are that way, and
Mhm.
that creates its own kinds of warped behaviors, if you will, that I don't think are in the interest of the taxpayers who send their uh, children and other relatives to these schools.
That's what and so we have a lot of these things operating as if they're independent agencies, as if they're untethered from the money that they get from us, when in fact they couldn't do what they do but for the taxpayer money.
Think about this. The Department of Education in the United States employs about 4,200 people, which is not much different than it employed in 2000, the year 2000. But its budget has gone up from 33 billion in 2000 to 250 billion. It pays a lot of contracts for
Oh
people to
yeah.
provide services, and also it provides for a lot of student loans. It's helped perpetuate this massive student debt problem. And if anybody investigated, they would be shocked at the amount of, I won't say it's illegal fraud, but people know how to manipulate the system to their own advantage, and people do it in order to survive economically
Right.
because they can't make ends meet otherwise. And therefore, students find themselves in a situation, they may get 2 degrees, gone into student debt to get those degrees, and they can't find a job. And at the same time, they have to pay off these debts, which puts them in a very
Oh,
nightmarish
it's
situation.
terrible.
And the Biden administration comes in and says, we'll forgive some of that, where people got themselves into that own situation.
Yes.
And, for the taxpayers to have to bail them out, in effect, that doesn't make much sense. But the system is corrupt. The system
And
is
and to me, the student loan relief, the attempts at it, was a form of corruption. It's Joe Biden, who is not a man of means, acting as if he's a billionaire himself, acting as if it's somehow his largesse, his generosity that got everyone this student loan relief. In fact, it's our money.
it's
You're not a
blatant.
good guy by spending our money.
It's blatant buying votes.
Yeah. And
It's
then
not the
what
only
what what
form of it.
what always would happen is right after the election, some ruling would come out and be like, "Oh yeah, by the way, that student loan relief, the court shot that down, so don't worry about that." And so Biden could say he tried, and the voter who went on that and followed that and thought he was actually going to get relief got nothing to show for it.
Remember
Let
when
me ask you
Biden?
this, Merrick.
Yes, sir.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say, to your point, when the federal government during the pandemic gave about $1,200 to people on average,
Yeah.
Biden said, remember where that came from and who sent it to you.
Right.
And people, think he was hoping that they'd nod and vote for him. There's no other reason to say something like that. I
I
mean,
mean, they won those 2 Senate seats in Georgia saying, if we win, $2,000 check will go out in the mail in early 2021. Didn't happen, but they said it and it mattered. Let me ask you this. Because the media has been freaking out about Donald Trump since he took the escalator ride in 2015. And so they've been hearing this hyperventilation for months now about the tariffs and what's going to happen and the panic. When might people actually feel any type of difference? I'm talking beyond, oh, my friend's cousin says that 6 people at their job were laid off because of tariff. I'm talking about when might people feel it, whether positive or negative?
Well, I think the biggest difference will come if they can pass a major tax reduction plan, which will
Hmm.
expand upon the tax cut that were enacted earlier and that they're going to try and continue. And that would provide for relief to Social Security recipients, for those who work on restaurant staffs that receive tips, and broader incentives for um, deferring taxes or being able to deduct taxes on interest from car loans, and perhaps a tax credit for purchases of American made cars, as well as investment credits. Those things I think will have the most immediate effect on the economy. The reduction in spending and those kinds of things is going to take more time, because you can only do it. Um, it's very difficult to root out the waste, fraud, and abuse, because so much of it is baked into the system, and so much spending goes up automatically because it's just built in to the budget itself, that inflation, it's tied to inflation or whatever else the case. So you're going to continue to spend more. But where they find it, they have to really claw it back, rescind it in some way or another, and that to some extent will require congressional approval. But they're making efforts in that. We didn't get ourselves in this position overnight. Anybody who thinks there might not be some short-term pain is mistaken. Trump has telegraphed everything he's going to do. He said, I'm going to cut spending. He said, I'm going to introduce protective tariffs to protect industries. I'm going to get ourselves out of the war in the Ukraine versus Russia. And I'm going to take other measures which a segment of the population is not going to like. And he's made a major attack on certain cultural programs that promote things like diversity, equity, inclusion that he thinks are too extreme.
Right.
And he has been, a large number of his executive orders deal with those initiatives, as well as another area where he gets a lot of heat from is on border security and wanting to deport immigrants, particularly those who are engaged in criminal activity or have criminal pasts. And in the process of rooting those out, there will be collateral people picked up who they find are here illegal as well, and they will be
There will.
deported. And there, a lot of people, find that just shocking and amazing and intolerable. But I really believe that a nation that can't control its borders really can't provide for the welfare of its citizens. And
Alyssa Slotkin would say the same thing and did during the
there,
last
and
campaign. That's why
therefore,
she won.
we have to be willing to take strong measures. And
Mhm.
it's not like we're talking about a minor problem. We're talking about over 10 million people in 4 years that came across the border. And the administration then said that, well, we don't have a problem at the border. The border's secure. And anybody who went down there and watched it, which they rarely did, knew that it wasn't. And all the people on the front lines could tell them just the opposite. And we saw the drugs floating across the border. There are illegal gangs operating in Michigan, ripping off people at high-end homes because they're part of a systematic criminal operation. We've introduced a new set of organized criminals.
Mm. So people are going to feel the initial pain. Trump says it. Everyone says it. Um, what would it take in the end for people to think that it's worth it? Like my thesis is that I would rather overpay for a t-shirt if my neighbor makes the t-shirt, because I know my neighbor's son might marry my daughter if I were to have kids. If I had kids, his son might marry my daughter, so I'm fine paying more as long as he has a stable, he's able to provide for his family. My neighborhood's better, our community's better. Someday he's going to be a member of my family. But that's like a 20, 30-year thought process. What's the immediate stuff? Is it the tax relief? What's
Well,
going
the
to make
tax
people
relief
think,
will certainly be
yeah,
important, but there will be an
yeah,
immediate increase in prices. I did some back of the envelope calculations. Let's say you
okay,
have a $50,000 car, the value of a $50,000 car when it comes to the border before the tariff. The tariff goes on that. And the tariff on the car that is imported will depend on the amount of domestic content in the car. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that 50% of the car that is at the border ready to be imported, it's produced by Ford in Mexico. It's worth $50,000 at declared value at the border, and 50% of it is non-US made. So that tariff will be applied to the $25,000 or the 50% of the $50,000 of that car. And that means that that car is going to have a tariff tacked onto it of about $5,700. And, 50,000 is close to the price of the average vehicle in the United States today. And that's going to be passed along in terms of increased prices that purchasers pay at the dealerships or wherever else they get the car if they get it directly through some other means. And it will shift demand for used cars, which are cheaper, and that will raise the price of used cars. And it could also shift demand to people who say, I want to buy the American domestic cars, but there may be a shortage of them.
right.
And therefore, the supply is down, the demand is up, and the price of those things will go up. And the ripple effect will occur throughout the economy. The profits and revenues of the firms will go down, and hence you'll have layoffs. And estimates indicate that there will be some layoffs associated with these tariffs, and that there will be reduced growth in GDP from what it would have been otherwise, and also that inflation could tick up. Now, the extent to which this happens, you have to realize, depends on the scope of overall economic activity. And imports are only 12% of the U.S. economy. We're a $30 billion economy. 25% of our economy is based on trade, imports, and exports. And therefore, imports are a smaller share of the economy that will be impacted directly by this. But again, there will be ripple effects that can't be denied. And so there have been estimates done that they expect the average price of a vehicle to go up anywhere from $4,000 to $10,000, that production of vehicles in North America will go down 10 to 20%, and that there might be the loss of jobs as a result of that. A lot depends on what other countries do, whether these tariffs last for a short or long period of time. They are intended in part to be reciprocal tariffs. Not all of them are intended for the same protective purposes as auto and steel and aluminum, which have
Right.
national security as well as domestic jobs concerns that are very keen. But there will be an effect. There's no doubt about ramifying that. You hope it's offset by other economic policies, but that remains to be seen. It's an open question. Transition will be painful at times, but I don't think there's anyone who would deny that if you get yourself in such a mess as we are in right now, that it's going to be easy to get out of it. I think
Right.
anybody who thinks that it's easy to cut government spending is in a fantasy world, because people do depend on it. They get an awful lot of it, but there is a lot of fraud in it. And people will say, oh, they're coming after my Social Security. No, they're coming after the people that receive it that it wasn't intended for.
That's exactly it. They're not just dependent, they're made to be dependent so as when this moment came, that program would be beyond review. Can't touch it. It's a hot potato.
I mean, and that's why time anybody comes in and talks about getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse and Social Security, and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer talked about it in 2011. They said, we got to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in Social Security. Everybody is for it then. They're against it now when Trump is doing it because he is doing it. Let's not forget that a lot of this vitriol is just pure hatred of Donald Trump and anything associated with Donald Trump. And that's why you see the criminal terroristic activity, I think, today that's being perpetrated against Tesla dealerships and Tesla owners. Just your average owner driving a Tesla down the street may be pulled over and somebody may attack that person in the car. I mean, this is maniacal behavior that somehow or another this Trump derangement syndrome has given people a sense that they have a license to execute when in fact they don't.
Yeah. It's funny what you were just saying about Pelosi and these things that used to be a consensus, at least on the left, the wrong person. I mean, at this point, if Trump said breathe air, Nancy Pelosi might hold her breath out of spite for the man. So they say politics makes for strange bedfellows. So does economics. In fact, I'd say
So
economics
economics
does
does,
more often than politics.
and that's
And so I'm thinking of the UAW right now, right? They have become kind of an unlikely ally. Sean Fain is saying, Trump is finally the kind of president we need after this NAFTA 30-year free trade disaster. He even says he'll work with Trump if he will reverse decades of working class people going backwards and blah, blah, blah. So the UAW is on board. Does it matter anymore? Do they have any juice? Can they actually be of help?
well, I think what really matters now is what people in the so-called working class feel about this. And I think many of them are going to say it's about time that
Which
we
is to
did
distinguish
something
them
about
from their union leadership.
Yes. And I think that there is a schism between the union leadership and the membership, and that increasingly people are independent thinkers. They don't let their unions tell them what
Yeah.
to believe. And this is particularly true, I think,
Solidarity isn't what it used to be, huh?
among private sector unions, particularly those that
Yeah.
represent manufacturers and longshore people who work in the maritime industry, though, and in the construction industry. The public sector unions are different, and almost half of the union members in the United States today are public sector unions. They tend to be more that there are to a large extent government employee unions. And so when the federal employee unions raise a fit about cutting federal employment, it's because they're directly impacted by that. They
Right.
represent federal workers. And they know that when you cut aid to universities and when you cut aid to state and local governments and other areas, that they're going to lose members' jobs. The teachers are going to lose jobs. The ASME workers that work for the county and the city, they're going to lose jobs. And therefore, they're going to line up very vocally against it. But
I see.
taxpayers are going to say, look, it's about time.
Yeah, especially here. I remember my parents freaking out about NAFTA before it even passed. I was 9 and 10 when it was under discussion. And I remember that being the talk that this could be a future where we're not the Motor City anymore. And that's exactly what happened. As I look at Sean Fain, though, I kind of see two faces. I see on one half, I see the possible ally, the guy who understands that tariffs, protectionism, especially when tariffs and protectionism are used against us, that is a means we can use to ensure we have well-paid neighbors and that we consume quality goods. On the other hand, I see a man who wants to make his mark on history, and people like that make me nervous. Fain wants to do a global general strike on May Day 2028. So Donald Trump is at this crucial time. He's deciding who his friends are, who his allies are. What is Sean Fain? Who's the real Sean Fain?
Well, the real Sean Fain, I think, no doubt, is somebody who has a leftist, more socialistic orientation and is very responsive to the members of his union who take a more activist position on those kinds of causes. And therefore, I think he may wear many different hats, and one day he may put on a pro-Trump, pro-tariff hat. It's a pro-tariff hat. It's not a pro-Trump hat.
Right. Right.
And he will, at the same time, in the same breath, say, we really detest this billionaire. We ought to eat the rich. And then,
Right.
therefore, we ought to engage in a May Day strike. And I think that is a throwback to old times that I don't think is going to have much appeal. But I would say there's a caveat to that an increasing number of Americans, particularly those associated with the Democratic Party, are okay with a more socialistic, Marxist, if you will, leaning.
Very much
And
so.
this is something that is recent in the American society. Historically, when I grew up, unions purged communists. They didn't want them in their ranks. And this was a legacy of the McCarthy era, among other things. But even preceded that, in which they, as Hubert Humphrey said, I'm a capitalist, but I believe in a lot of social welfare programs, which are good, and I'm a strong supporter of labor unions. I believe in labor unions. I believe that workers are entitled to effective representation because I don't have that much faith in the wisdom of management.
Which is man, which is imperfect and fallen. And of course, I don't trust them. Why would I?
And so therefore, and management changes. You get used to one manager who's good, and then they come in, they get rid of
Hmm.
that manager, they bring somebody else in that has a whole different orientation and approach to things because top management has said this is the way it's going to be now. And the workers kind of stuck with it without many options, particularly if there aren't jobs readily available for many workers, which is the case. Uh, Therefore, I think let's not be fooled. Um, Behind all the veneer of saying things that may sound simpatico with Trump at a given point in time, there's real hostility to him. The UAW hasn't endorsed a Republican for president. I can't foresee it doing that. The question, I think, for the future of the American political system is where the Republican Party is going to go post Trump.
Absolutely.
Is it going to go back to the Rhino, what I'll call the country club, the cocktail hour version of the Republican Party that I'm very familiar with, that Richard Nixon tried to change, Ronald Reagan tried to change, but that George Bush and George W. Bush were more part of than you had with a person certainly like Trump. And that's an open question to me. I'm not certain where it will go without Trump.
Absolutely. We're all looking to see it because when you look at the 2018 ballot without his name on it, not a good year for Republicans in Michigan. 2022 ballot without his name on it, not a good year for Republicans. And so the Trump effect, yes, he personally has had great success, but he's one man and the movement will have to go on without him. So we've talked about the dark side of tariffs, but I think the bright side that people are looking for is an idea that Trump has mentioned that it's kind of exciting. And I'm not an economist. I'm not a Charlie LaDuff. So tell me if this even sounds realistic. He's talked about the idea that, hey, maybe this tariff thing will take off to the point we could replace the income tax in America, which did not always exist. So, kind of a two-parter. A, is that plausible? And B, how did we fund the American government prior to the income tax?
Well, to answer your last question first, prior to the income tax, which took effect in the early 1900s, we funded the government primarily through tariffs. And during the 19th century, tariffs were strongly supported by the Republican Party. You had situation, I think I mentioned this the last time I was with you, that Abraham Lincoln was a protectionist.
Yes.
McKinley was a protectionist, a big protectionist, while he was a member of Congress and also while he was president. That began to shift in the early 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt argued for more, particularly when he was with the Bull Moose Party in 1912. We argued for a reduction in tariffs, but he had a lot of other pro-worker kinds of programs on his agenda, such as the minimum wage, child labor laws, etc. Um, so it is an evolving situation in which the parties really changed their sentiments. The Republicans became the free traders, and the Democrats were probably somewhat more reluctant to do that, a large extent to which Southern Democrats in particular, who had to pay the tariff but didn't export a lot of manufactured goods,
Right.
opposed the tariffs. And they had a key role to play in Congress when the Southern segregationists were really the dominant wing of the Democratic Party in the Congress in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to a large extent. But that's been shifted. The theory of the case for Trump is that you're going to see people want to buy more American, that American companies are going to use this pressure to invest more here, that foreign companies are going to come in, the Hyundais, the Hondas, the Toyotas, and those companies that feed into the auto industry, that provide products that are built into cars. Think about it. In cars and planes, there are thousands and millions of parts that are manufactured. If we can bring as much of them here as possible, the auto
Right.
part industry, the airline part industry, the healthcare machine part industry, if we can bring those things back to the United States, then you'll have growth in manufacturing, which is value added, which has spin-off benefits in research and development, new industries, and efficiencies in production. And that these companies will be in a position to take advantage of automation, which would reduce the impact of rising labor costs. So all of those things you hope within tax policies, regulation policies that are encouraging for businesses, you'll see a spark in growth. That's the theory of the case. And more productivity goes up, you'll have less inflation, which will be facilitated by lower relative government spending, more prudent spending and efficient spending, and less regulation.
There's a movement, we'll get you out of here on this one. There's a movement in Michigan right now called Axe My Tax. They're trying to get on the 2026 ballot, and this is a gross oversimplification. So Carla Wagner, don't get too mad at me, but basically they want to eliminate property taxes in Michigan and make up that shortfall with revenue sharing and things of that nature. Are you familiar with that idea? And is there any way these numbers can be made to pencil out to an extent where people would be comfortable eliminating local taxes?
Well, I'm not intimately familiar with that tax situation, but it was tried in California in the 1970s. And there was a strong effort to reduce property taxes then. I believe that efforts to reduce property taxes, all forms of taxes, are the direction that we ought to pursue as a society so that people have more money in their own pocket to spend the way they would like to. Government taxes really deprive people of an ability to take care of themselves, even though some of the money is through transfer payments given back to them. But often these are not the most efficient ways of allocating resources in a society. And they make people dependent on what you provide them rather than the
Right.
seekers of their own or the pursuers of their own destiny. And it's a philosophical issue. And I happen to believe in more limited government in which we reduce. If you tax people more, people will find a way to spend it. There's no
Right.
doubt about that. And there is creep in bureaucracy will continue to grow. And eventually you will crowd out the private sector. And people at some point in time, if you have deficit spending, debt goes up, they'll have to be forced into situations where they have to take very austere measures to bring about a
Mm-hmm.
realignment in their economy. And that can be extremely painful. And I think that's some of the pain we're feeling now when people are saying, oh, if we cut this employee, one less person to answer the phone at the Internal Revenue Service. Well, good luck with the Internal Revenue Service. That's all I have to say. They
Yeah.
owe me back taxes from 2017. I can't get
Jeez.
anybody to even tell me what the situation is because somebody filed taxes in my name. I had somebody during the pandemic file unemployment benefits in my name. Had to
No.
go through a rigmarole about that.
Oh my, what a nightmare. It's hard enough dealing with Marvin when you're trying to get your money. I can't imagine it's any easier when you're trying to give it back or say it's fraud or like you
Yes,
probably I never during the pandemic, I never once called the unemployment line, and not only did I not hear a person, I never heard the phone ring. It went straight to voicemail.
well, I think, notwithstanding the efforts to improve government services, they haven't improved. In 2000, to conclude on this note, in 2000, I did a study for the Clinton administration on labor management partnerships. One of the agencies we looked at was the Federal Emergency Management Association. That agency, as well as the Center for Disease Control, as well as for the Internal Revenue Service, as well as the Veterans Administration, were all part of my study. And one of the concerns that they had was that these organizations weren't performing well. And I think that's true. The systems that they use are flawed. The um, the machinery, the information technology that they use is antiquated. And therefore they would fail any kind of test in the private sector in terms of meeting efficiency standards. And yet they'll spend billions of dollars to consultants to come in or vendors to come in and upgrade their programs that seem to last interminably. And you have to ask yourself, why is this going on? Why doesn't the air traffic control system in the United States have the most up-to-date technology that it could possibly have?
Seriously. Yeah.
I mean, what's the excuse for not having it?
It's kept inefficient so that it needs to be fixed at a later date. It's just like when every school in Michigan got all this COVID money, they didn't use it on the buildings. And then to start this school year in September, there were schools around me, even in Oakland County. I mean, it's a rich area in theory, and schools around me were closed. I think even in Southfield were closed because of excessive heat. I thought you guys just got government stimulus that was supposed to be transformational. Where's the transformation?
Well, I mean, you have to ask yourself what they use that for, and I think there's all a thing we used to call fiscal substitution, the concern about whether
Yes.
money given to states and localities would be used to really fund their operating budgets.
Bingo. Or
And
in a case like an Ann Arbor schools, we're going to hire people knowing that this is one-time money. We're going to make a 20-year commitment to somebody using money that I have to spend by X date and try to force a game of chicken where no one wants to see school, teacher numbers go down. And so lawmakers, someone's going to have to pick up that shortfall because no one wants the bad headline.
or we're going to hire another administrator, we're going to hire another counselor, and we're going to hire another social worker to come in as if we're, a mental rehabilitation operation,
Right.
and that instead of an educational operation. I think that's the psychology of what Trump is talking about trying to change. I mean, it's a big picture of changing the culture of a society, and that won't happen overnight. But he got elected because a lot of people are very dissatisfied with the direction of the country. When he says now people think we're moving more in the right direction, they're looking at the changes he's trying to make in the culture, the changes he's trying to make in government spending, in government employment and in other things, and they think, well, it's about time we did something like this.
Absolutely. Marick, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people learn more about yourself?
They can reach me on X. They can find me at Marick Masters. They can reach me at my YouTube channel, Marick Masters. I have several podcasts which deal with business, the economy, labor, and politics.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Have a good day, sir.